Chapter 1. Alex. I think it's Friday, but I don't know the time or where I am. Is it a small island off the coast of Miami, or Cuba? All I know is I've been in my stateroom too long, and it's getting to me because I've been staring at nothing but water. No. Don't marry him, I murmured as I dressed for dinner. Don't do it. Nothing is worth doing something as drastic as marrying that man. My mind had been warning me, but I wouldn't listen. I felt desperate, because Max had left Jonas and I no way out. We had used up every dime we had for food and shelter, and we were one step from the streets. That wouldn't have looked good for me, if I sought custody of my children. I could read it in the papers. Alexandra Blackstone living on the streets with the heir to the Blackstone fortune. No, it wasn't the prominent rich industrialist, Maximillian Blackstone, who Alexandra took up with after the hot and oh so hot and handsome Max booted her out and kept custody of the children. But the other one, the royal bad boy handsome green-eyed fuck-up Jonas Blackstone. The talk in New York and Palm Beach would be now that I'd married the elusive Christian for his money, and they'd be right. He was too young for me. My age, but then that didn't matter because I was after one thing, and that was his money. He knew it and I knew it, but what I didn't know was he had a dark side and I never saw it. I'd been blinded by the thought that I could get Jonas and me out of this nightmare that Max had dropped us into and condemned us to. When Max was loving, he loved deeply like his brother Jonas. But Max had another side when someone crossed him, and he thought Jonas had fallen in love with me, and that wasn't true, at least not on my part. Now Maximilian had become ruthless, and aimed his revenge at the two people who loved him the most. I never questioned Jonas when he came to me with this scheme, and I admitted I was taken by Christian Kenley. Who wouldn't be? He was young and handsome, and at the time sweet. Whenever Jonas had proposed a scheme, and begged me to help him, I would look at all the ways it would go wrong. Murphy's Law had been in the back of my mind, but for some reason I'd forgotten about all the things that could go wrong, and walked into this with eyes wide open. But this time I took Jonas with me instead of him reaching for me and dragging me down a hole with him as he'd done on many occasions, because I wanted to help him. Looking into the mirror and swiping my lipstick across my lips, I stopped and leaned and took a good look at myself. This hadn't worked out as I'd planned. Nevertheless, against my judgment, I once again followed Jonas's lead. And where had that gotten me before? In all kinds of trouble with Max, and now he'd divorced me and left me and Jonas without any resources, and not to mention I couldn't see my children. Sucking in a deep breath and swiping my cheeks with a pink blush, I finished the job of looking beautiful for my husband, even though the last thing I wanted to do was see anyone. If I could stay in my stateroom for the entire voyage, it wouldn't bother me. I had a beautiful place here with a terrace where I could get some sun. My breakfast and dinner were brought promptly every morning and evening. What did I have to do but to think about how to extract myself from this situation, and from all the shit I found myself in, and the mess that had finally caught up with me. I was knee-deep in a hot mess, as they said, and I didn't know how to pull myself out. Jonas was even more fucked up, and in a worse situation than I had been when Max had divorced me. Jonas had lost the only woman he'd loved, and so had I lost Max. But as long as Max and I were alive, I vowed I'd get him back, if only to make him pay for the anguish he'd cost me, because of his jealousy toward his brother Jonas. Now all we had was each other. Max couldn't have designed this better if he'd tried. Jonas and I together, an item, now that was a joke, the dom and dominatrix. Sure, I'd married Christian because he made promises to me, and offered access to lawyers to fight Max. He was handsome, had a great-looking body, young, rich, but cold-hearted, mixed with a heavy dose of cunning. It appeared I'd been attracted to men who had a certain amount of ice running through their veins, where I thought I could change them. That's a fucking laugh. The only man I ever knew who had a heart was Jonas. But I'd never consider him because 1, he was Max's twin, and 2, he wasn't my type, too warm and loving and way too easy. The opposite of Max. I thought I could change Christian though, because he was younger than Max, like I thought I could change Max. I knew what turned on a man like Christian because I'd met them in bondage clubs from the West Coast to the East Coast, and it was one thing in particular they craved: their love for pain, their desperation to have me inflict that pain on them. Handcuff or tie them to a bed, and whip their asses as they jacked themselves off. With the case of Max, who had been the only man to claim my body and soul, he'd come inside of me after I'd used my whip on his superb body. Then he'd beg to have sex with me, and I loved it when he'd fallen into bed spent, and ate my pussy, and after he'd gotten hard from that, fucked me all night. That was my sexual ritual with Max, living for the brutal pain of flogging him and dominating him in bed. Then he would tie my arms and ankles, and fuck me on all fours as he lashed my ass. I can say now I missed the love of my life, but I despised him because he chose to punish me for what I didn't do. I never had sex with Jonas and never loved him the way I loved Max. I never loved Jonas in the way Max had accused me. I never loved any man the way I loved Maximillian Blackstone. I thought now, since Max had thrown me to the wolves, as they said, I could tap into men's sexual desires which came with their pain, and I could find a reason to walk away from him, and my desire for him would leave too. However, we were so much alike in our sexual desires, our stubborn nature, but Max made his choices and I don't think I could forgive him. Before I ran from him, but he'd find me and used my children, and he's still pulling that stunt, but it's too late for all of us. Too late for Max and too late for Jonas, because now I have someone that doesn't ask much of me, and he doesn't even ask me to have sex with him. After having a full sexual life with Max, I welcome the rest I'm getting. Max had been a man I could love even with all his faults, but we had one thing in common: we loved to turn each other on with our love of S&M, and I knew Max could satisfy me and I could be everything to him, until I wasn't, and I found myself marrying this handsome, cold-hearted dude, and I hoped I'd never learn what made his dick hard. I wanted to keep my feelings for Max, because deep down I didn't want anyone to take his place. I used to worship Max, but he left me to the horrible men who stalked around looking for women like me. Lonely and rich, and with a unique skill that attracted rich degenerates. All I had to keep me company was Jonas Blackstone, a deviant in his own right, but Jonas was of no use to me because I had a sexual desire that only Max could fill. However, when Christian came along and I needed something from him, he proposed marriage, and in my desperation, I didn't read the small print, like beware of strangers bearing gifts. He wanted to marry me right off, turn over his estate to me, and I'd agreed. I just threw away the lessons I'd learned after meeting Maximillian Blackstone. If it looked too good to be true, it probably was. If a man is handsome, he's using that beautiful face and charming smile to get what he wanted from a desperate woman, or man. Nevertheless, Jonas was handsome, and had a childlike smile, and he could get me to do anything he wanted, and I did. He and Max are twins, and just like I couldn't resist Max, Jonas rated up there with Max, or even higher, when he stared at me with his handsome face and asked me, "Help me, Alex. Just this last time. I need you." And I fell into that trap because he and Max had this way about them that could charm a butterfly out of its cocoon prematurely. Because I'd lost Max, I wanted to feel love and see anyone who resembled Max. It was then I agreed to marry Christian to keep me and Jonas together, and from being destitute. I had to help Jonas once more to get his life straight and under control with the money this man was offering me. However, it was also me who needed help this time, and I couldn't blame Jonas for my misdirection, my ridiculous behavior, and fuck-ups like marrying a billionaire to fight Max every time I found myself unable to handle what Max had thrown in my way, to either bring me back to him on my knees or destroy me if he couldn't. Whenever this happened, and it appeared it had been occurring often lately, I wanted to punish Max by leaving him, but he beat me to it this time, and now my plan was to make him pay for not believing I had nothing to do with Jonas. Jonas was like a little brother I never had, although he was much older than me. I took up with this gorgeous young man named Christian that first thought I could control, because it was no controlling a mature older Max in his late 30s. His birthday had passed and he was now 40 and a billionaire, and Jonas his twin also 40, and he and I were broke after Max jumped the gun when he'd found us in bed because of the horrible death of Jonas's wife on their marriage night. Max had rushed to judgment, or he'd been confused after his accident, I don't know which, but there was no excuse for his behavior. The only defense I could give Max when he saw two exhausted, depressed people together lying in each other's arms was he wasn't thinking straight after he'd survived a small plane crash on his way to Jonas's wedding. Who could make love to a man who had just lost the love of his life? You, Max accused, staring at me, his heated eyes consumed with hatred and jealousy directed at the only two people who'd ever loved him more than life, me and Jonas. Chapter 2. Alex. When I thought Max had died in plane accident, Jonas had awakened in bed in his rented home to discover his wife had been killed. He found her lying next to him as he slept. She had died by the hands of her enraged, estranged lover, and he'd committed suicide near their bed. He left no note explaining his actions. I guess killing Jonas's wife and himself said it all. If he couldn't have her, no one else could either. I never understood that kind of love, painless. Max and I engaged in a different sort, where pain and pleasure had sustained our relationship over the years. I guess I fell more in love with Max when I could inflict pain on him. He must be head over heels in love with me, because lately I've been in the worst pain of my life. Max jumped to the worst conclusions when he strolled into Jonas's rental to discover me in bed with Jonas. It wasn't what he'd thought, nor was it what it appeared to be if anyone had walked in on us. We were two people who had drunk too much, consoling each other, and had fallen into each other's arms for sleep and comfort, when Max stood patiently over us watching, growing angrier the longer he stood there not waking us. In that time he'd convinced himself what he'd guessed about my relationship with Jonas had been the truth. Truth isn't black and white. There is gray which lies somewhere between the black and white. I loved Jonas but not the way Max conceived, and I could not convince him as many times as I'd tried. He had fashioned this scenario in his mind, and wouldn't ask himself the question of why. Why would I risk it all to be with Jonas? Max didn't take time to ask me or Jonas, why would I risk all I had in life and all that I loved, my children, him, a gorgeous billionaire like Max, to be with Jonas, his twin brother who was penniless, a fuck-up, and stayed in trouble because he'd made wrong choices with women? It didn't make sense to me. Max was more captivating than Jonas. Jonas had a shyness about him, nevertheless, every bit as handsome, and both were gorgeous men in their late 30s. However, Max had a dark side that I craved. I needed to dominate him in bed, and the sex was incredible when we were together. Now Max has finally dominated me, and maybe destroyed me as long as he had possession of my children, and by taking who he is and his body away where he'd satisfy me in every possible way, I will never be the same until I can return the favor by destroying him. When he realized I wouldn't beg him to return to his bed, and I'd married someone else, he would then experience the full brunt of my fury. There would be no way in hell I'd leave Christian now for him or Jonas, and when Max discovers who I'd married, then the fun will begin. Max had been jealous from the beginning. From the first time we'd laid eyes on each other. The passion and heat between us couldn't be extinguished until now. His incessant jealousy of any man who came near me had put a wedge between us, and his suspicions of Jonas had caused a rift between the two. Jonas had fallen into depression, and I felt sorry for him and wanted to help him. However, I couldn't blame Max for all of it. I always took Jonas's side whenever he'd fucked up like he had in Florida. And once again, I've put myself in a difficult situation, and the way it's looking, there's no port for me from this storm called Christian Kenley I'd sailed into, not realizing the danger that laid ahead. All I can see is a dark sky, and the storm is getting ready to rage, and I don't have Jonas or Max to save me. I hate the water, and here I am on a yacht going who knows where with a man I wouldn't be caught dead with. And that's the problem, maybe I would end up dead. I don't know, and I rarely care anymore lately since Max had once again taken everything from me in a fit of jealousy. This was all he ever wanted to do, to get me to obey him. He knew who I was when he met me, and now he's acting as if it's a surprise that I'm a dominant, and that I won't take orders from him or anyone. He should be kissing my feet literally, as he'd done many times in the past when I brought out the spike heels and plowed into his back, then used my whips and handcuffs on him, and he loved every minute of my abuse. We thrived on the abuse we'd inflicted on each other. Until now. Just the thought of what he and I did behind closed doors had my clit throbbing and needing him. Where the fuck are you, Max, and you, Jonas, when I need my husband and my friend? Oh, but you aren't my husband, Max, and you, Jonas, have abandoned me to this freak, I murmured, hoping he didn't have my stateroom bug. But I wouldn't put it past him. Jonas had told me all about Christian after the fact. All the women he'd married and divorced. Let's hope he divorced them, and when would he file for divorce from me? I hoped as I dressed in the gown he'd chosen for me for dinner. Whose idea was it to marry this pervert? I murmured as I turned, trying to zip up the gown. I guess it was mine, and I can't deny that. I took the easy way out, and now I've discovered that nothing is easy in the world of the Blackstones, because once you enter their orbit of hidden sexual secrets, billionaires with money, it never stops until you cash out or crash and burn. That's the only way off their spaceship of craziness. Turning and staring at myself in the mirror, wondering how I got here, I know I'm in for the ride of my life. Jonas did warn me against marrying this man. I was only supposed to stay with Christian until I had enough power and money to fight Max on my own terms, and to get possession of my children, and the way this is going, I might never see Max or my children again. I sucked in a deep breath, not because the gown was too tight. I barely weighed 110 pounds, because I haven't been sleeping or eating. For once I wished I had listened to Jonas, but Jonas had never had an original thought or a successful one in his life. To follow him would take me back to those hellish men he knew who committed murders, revenge, kidnappings because of their strange sexual desires. It appeared all Max and Jonas knew were men of that sort, with strange behaviors rich men are prone to when money no longer makes their dicks hard. Before meeting Max and Jonas, my world had been simple, trying to survive in college with only my tuition paid by a mother I never knew. Then I thought I was catching hell trying to pay rent and feed myself. That was simple. I never understood how complicated life was until I crossed paths with Max and Jonas Blackstone. I should have run at first sight of this incredible handsome man with too much money and too much time on his hands, but I didn't, and now I'm paying the price and I don't know if I can. I stared out the window of this mile-long yacht in my bedroom, equipped with a large terrace the length of my room. I have been married for a month, and rarely does Christian visit me except to ask me to disrobe. He glares at me for a second or two, places his palm over his covered cock, and then leaves. Under any other circumstances I'd be happy, because I hadn't planned on having sex with him anyway. He had relieved me of the burden of pretending I loved him or wanted him to fuck me, and for that I'm grateful. His yacht is moving now, and I don't know where I'm going, and no one has told me. Good morning, madam, did you sleep well last night? He placed the tray on the table, and on it there was a container with a lid, under it a plate containing food Christian had ordered for me. The utensils were wrapped in a decorative napkin with the initials CK. The glass had the same initials in gold on it. Everything on the yacht wore gold lettering with CK embossed on it. Everyone and everything except me. And I wondered when that stamp of possession would begin. I stared at the steward, who appraised me with his eyes. I expected to have lunch or dinner, I didn't know which, not engage in a conversation about how well I slept. I wasn't sure of the time, because there were no clocks and I had no cell reception to depend on. I could check the horizon or ask someone, and I had been afraid to do that. Me afraid. That's a new one too. However, there have been many firsts for me, since I've been alone with a strange man I happened to marry out of desperation. For that I blame Max. The steward cuts through my thoughts with a smile, and he's standing over the food, removing the lid, hiding a rare steak and some vegetables, expecting me to taste it. I refused to do what was expected of me, and turned to him. How do you know I want to eat now? I didn't ask for food. I'm not hungry. I pouted, but I'm sure it had been wasted on him. He glanced at me with a raised eyebrow, as if those were the only words of English he knew. I know he's displeased with me, but I don't give a fuck. I suspect he speaks more than one language, unlike me who knows one universal language, English. I've seen him several times a day, and that's all he says every morning and evening. Then he leaves the food and exits the room. When I'm sleeping, and that's often, someone enters my room and removes the uneaten food. At least I'm not locked in, however, for what it's worth, I might as well be. I'm still a prisoner because water surrounds this boat. I sauntered over to the food he'd placed on the table, raised the top and leaned in to smell it. I sat and began to cut into the steak when another knock is louder, and Christian doesn't wait for me to invite him in. When he closes the door behind him, he stands in the same spot, smiles with a closed smile, and the strange glare in his eyes slice through me. You are beautiful. I never would have known you were this lovely if I didn't have you here in the flesh. The way he says flesh and his eyes widen makes my skin crawl. It's strange thinking of him as my husband, because Max is the only man I'd envisioned being my husband, and if he's gone out of my life, then I know I would never want another man. Christian is 25, 5 years my junior, not that much I guess, and what could he possibly want from me when he should have been chasing younger single women and a virgin or two? Maybe he is because I seldom see him during the day, and never at night. I really don't give a fuck, I'm thinking when I chased his words with my eyes, but I didn't hear him talking. I see him cross the room and stand near me. He rakes his fingers through my hair and makes some comment, but I don't hear him because my mind is lost on Max and my children. Christian leaned over and kissed me on the forehead. I think it's the least I can do to raise my face and offer a kiss, but he wants more, and I can see it in his eyes, and he's not at all hard on the eyes, and after all I am his wife, I have to convince myself. Am I justifying my reason for being married to him, and I'm feeling hot with sexual desire about now? Hell yes. Normally I would be close to Max, waking up and turning over in my sheer gown with Max between my legs asking me not to shave because he enjoys the look and smell of my clit, and I hear Christian's voice and I'm relieved. I don't like thinking about Max now. It's too late, and I have to make the best of a bad situation. It confuses me when all I think about is how Max makes love to me. I will never be happy as long as I have Max on the brain. I bought you some clothes I'd like you to wear. I'm having a party. Someone will. I thought I was dressing in this gown for a party, and for you. I turned to show him how cool and relaxed it is. It's white and made of cotton with a slit in the back and cut low in front. Oh, that's for me, he said, kissing my shoulder, then my cleavage. I love when you go through the trouble of dressing up for me, but I had some special clothes flown here. I chose the ensemble because I wanted you to look special. I want everyone to see the beautiful and exciting Alexandra. You know, with men like me and my friends, we've heard about you, and you're a prized. Now I'm like a prized cow? Christian raised an eyebrow and his expression changed. His forehead furrowed, but he didn't say a word. He lifted his head and turned his back to me. Why didn't you consult me? I would have had the opportunity to choose what I wanted to wear. He frowned, his forehead made a deep V before he turned in my direction, then he raised an eyebrow once more. Clearly he didn't like what I was saying to him. That signaled he wanted to be in control. I wasn't used to being controlled, and he knew it. I had inadvertently expressed to him how I'd fought against Max monitoring me. He pretended he understood, but now I see that was his way of gaining my confidence. He didn't mumble, but bit his lip as if that would stop him from exploding. I could see his eyes moving when choosing his words. I'm sorry. Next time we'll go shopping at one of the ports, but I had these flown in for you and I want you to wear them. I want you to wear one tonight. Tonight? I questioned. I've never seen you at night, and when can I go out on deck? I haven't been introduced to your crew, and you said there are 40 people on this boat. I'd like to talk to someone. "It's not a boat, it's a vessel, my beloved," he said, tightening his jaw. I never knew he read the Bible, and I doubt he had, unless he'd been asking for forgiveness for something he'd done in the past. Who says beloved these days as if he's out of the 1st century, and who gives a fuck if it's a boat or vessel, I wanted to say, but I refrained from doing so as long as he had me captive on this fucking boat. I glanced at him and damn, but he's cute. Maybe I could play along with him, and perhaps tie him up and give him the Blackstone treatment. Turn him into what I want and control him, I thought. I really shouldn't think like that. I don't want this man, but I do want to take my frustrations out on someone, if not Max, then Christian. "We should have arrived in port, shouldn't we?" I asked when I rose and sauntered around, kissing Christian lightly on his lips. I stood playfully showing off my gown, twirling around like a ballet dancer. He offered me a forced smile, while I offered him a deceptive one. He pulled me into him and placed his arms around me, then I glanced out at the open sea. "Do you think I can go sightseeing when we dock?" I whispered, turning on the balls of my feet to face him. "The shoreline from what I can see looks beautiful. There are homes, and it even has a yacht club." "You can't leave." "I have my reasons," he snapped, as I bit my bottom lip before pursing it and trailing my manicured finger along the lines of his mouth. I stared in his eyes, but he lowered his eyes as if I had power over him. But I couldn't see this power, even if it had been a false one, the way I'd seen it with Max. It diminished once Max became unreasonable and wouldn't listen to me. There was something in Christian's eyes, his closed smile, which led me to believe I didn't mean anything to him. I can't say I was surprised because I felt nothing for him as well, but I did think my sexual appeal would last longer than a few months, especially since we'd never been intimate, and he thought I'd been desirable, as he'd said on more than one occasion. He's pretending he's interested in me, but there's a coldness behind his kind of warmth, and I feel it when he touches my hand and places his lips on mine. He won't give in to me on anything I've requested because I don't represent what I thought: a wife, a sexual partner. Then I'll have to insist and take my freedom, I thought, offering him a closed smile in return as I run my palm over his smooth and shaven skin. My feelings consume me once more, but this time I hear him, or I'm reading his lips. I don't know which. "I'm inviting guests aboard my yacht this evening, to feast their eyes on my beautiful wife and my new yacht, of course." "Of course that's why you're planning this party," I thought, not believing a word of it. "And there is one more thing," he added. "What is it?" Christian stared at me with his dark grayish-blue eyes. His eyes were mysterious, like a man with a tortured soul that couldn't find peace, and I saw his soul in that one hooded glance. When I concentrated on his face and locked eyes with him, it appeared deceptive and evil, but maybe I'd been seeing too much evil lately to know the difference. Christian's face was young, beautiful and handsome, pretty almost, but those eyes were hard and dark, and he tried to hide them by looking down when he spoke to me. Sometimes when he doesn't want to answer questions or acknowledge me, his forehead would furrow, followed by a wide grin. Oh, he was indeed a good actor. I wondered what he had been hiding behind those deceptive good looks. All his mannerisms and false gestures didn't bother me, because I hadn't planned on hanging around much longer. I just needed the money he'd promised me, if I remained his wife for a suitable length of time. My timeline was different than his, I supposed, and I didn't want to upset things now by asking him how long would he hold me captive on this fucking boat. Walking away, I found the chair in front of the table holding my uneaten food. "You need to eat, sweetheart." "I thought you liked me the way I am." I was barely a size 6. Down from a size 8, because of all the worry and problems of finding myself homeless because of Max, and being alone and not having Jonas to keep me company. From the reflection from the patio doors, I was probably looking at a size 3. "I have these strenuous things that I love to do, and if you're going to keep up with me, you have to be fit and in shape," Christian announced, as if I was a friend he'd challenged to a mile race up a mountain. "Like what?" I questioned. What could it be? He didn't look like a runner or climber. His body had muscles, but they were natural, and the rest he'd gotten from a home gym and a trainer. I'd never seen him completely without all his clothes, however, he'd seen me numerous times. I wasn't sure what the rest of him looked like. Jonas had said he'd heard disturbing things about Christian, but Jonas never divulged exactly what those things were, and I never pressed him further. Knowing Jonas, it could be any number of deviant things from sexual affixation to tying up women and keeping them in a dungeon, but there are no dungeons here, I thought. But I could be wrong. With a ship this large, and a crew that appeared to be motivated to keep quiet, there could be any number of things going on. Christian stood behind me and rested his large hands on both sides of the chair I'd been sitting in. My food was getting cold now as I stared down at the second plate I'd been given as an alternative to red meat. That plate contained small sandwiches without crust and caviar. He leaned down, and I felt his breath on my neck when he said, "I hope you don't mind, but I invited Blackstone." I interrupted him before the remaining words fell from his mouth, and he moved away to gaze out at the sea. My pulse raced, my heart beat loudly, and I swore Christian could hear it from where he stood in this enormous bedroom the size of the first floor of my apartment in New York. "Why would you invite my husband?" Then he twisted his body around for a second, gazed at me as if he could bore through me. I stared at him. He swiveled back and looked out at the water surrounding us, but only for a second. I wished I could read his mind. His expression wasn't hard to read when he turned to face me in a quick motion. He wore a horrible grin where his face never moved, but the sides of his mouth curled upward, and when that grin faded he raised one eyebrow, questioning my ill-timed response. "You're no longer his wife. You belong to me," he growled. With those few words he'd expressed what he'd intended to do and how he felt about me. I was his. A piece of merchandise he had overpaid for, and he was intent of getting the use out of it if it was the last thing he did. I could only hope I'd figure out how to get away from him with my body and soul intact. As quickly as he'd turned to face me and make his declaration, he swiveled around on the balls of his feet, crossing the room, once again standing at the large glass door staring out and away from me when he said, "I'm going scuba diving today before my guest arrive." Then he aimed a wide, warm smile. "Do you want to come with me?" It had been amazing how he could go from warm to cold in seconds. Of course I wanted to go down under the sea with just he and I, and the sharks. A good way to rid yourself of a disagreeable wife, or convince her she could be thrown in the ocean if she opposed him. "You know, Christian, I think I told you that I'm afraid of the water. I can swim, but I choose not to." A satisfied grin crawled across his full pink lips. "I forgot, sweetheart. We're just going to have to do something about that." I glared at him because this should be the last place I should be caught, on a vessel surrounded by water and terrified of it, and now Christian. "If it's okay with you, I will use the pool on the bottom deck and get in some practice." He didn't object, and I took that as it was okay as long as I didn't go ashore. Max owned a few yachts, and he'd tried for years to get me to travel with him, and now I'd do anything to be with him on our yacht. I guess it's too late now. There are some things you can't wish away, and some things you can't go back to. I stared at Christian with his back to me, leaning on the railing looking down and around. What Christian didn't realize was I've dealt with men like him before, handsome, rich, and spoiled. I wished I wasn't wrong about him, and he could be reasoned with like all the other sexual deviants who would give their souls for something kinky as hell, and I hoped I had enough kink in my toolbox to satisfy him until I could rid myself of him for good. An announcement came for Christian in my stateroom from the captain, and I was saved by the bell once more. "There's a problem, Alex. They need me." I couldn't imagine what they needed him for when this state-of-the-art vessel actual sailed itself. But then Christian was the kind of man who wanted control of everything he'd owned, including me. When he strolled to the door he said, "You should be dressed by 9 to meet my guest and not wearing any of the clothes you bought, but only what I'm sending to your cabin." And he turned, opened the door and left me shaking. Not by his words, but by the smirk covering his face after he'd pursed his lips and ghosted a kiss to me.